immediately after the election of Jimmy Carter, an interview was published in Playboy magazine, which I assure you I did not read in the original. But everybody interested in politics saw reprints of it fast. The interview was with Hamilton Jordan, who was probably the vocal spokesman at the time for Carter, had been very important in getting him elected, very politically astute, but not politically astute enough. In that report, he made an astounding statement. He perceived himself as an outsider, and he perceived Carter as an outsider. And he made this statement. He said, if Cy Vance becomes Secretary of State, and if Zbig Brzezinski takes over national security, we've failed, and I'll quit. Both events happened within a couple of months, and Hamilton Jordan did not quit. That statement, in just a few words, was at the very heart of what this country has been facing since at least 1921. Of course, 1921, for those of you who don't know, that was the year of the formation of the Council on Foreign Relations, or the CFR, which has been dominant in not just American foreign policy, but in American domestic policy ever since. Something in the range of 300 CFR and Trilateral Commission members joined the Carter administration at that time. Those Christian conservatives who had voted for him at that point, if they were astute at all, realized that no fundamental change was likely. And in fact, Susan Huck, who I think is one of the most perceptive writers of that era, made this classic statement. She said that CFR Team B has just replaced CFR Team A, which is pretty close to the truth. Almost immediately, it became clear that Carter's policies would not vary in any fundamental way from what had preceded immediately before him Ford, and of course Nixon won presidency back. He was a Democrat, but he was not going to fundamentally alter domestic policy. And in fact, in terms of Federal Reserve policy, it got worse. It was bad under Nixon because Nixon took us off what little remained of the gold standard in 1971. And under Arthur Burns from 71 until about 76, 77, inflation began to increase. But then under the immediate appointee of Carter, it really began to increase under the expansion of Federal Reserve monetary policy, became highly inflationary, went into, by 1979 or 80, was into 11, 12% per annum. Highest peacetime inflation that we had seen in the 20th century. And so you had, he negotiated the SALT Treaty with the Soviets, and in that famous, unbelievably stupid symbol, after signing it with Brezhnev, walked over and kissed him on the cheek. Now, you can make the case for arms limitation, but you cannot make a strong case for the kiss of peace with Leonid Brezhnev, Leonid Brezhnev. The oil shock, the second oil shock, first being 73, the second one came on his watch. High price of oil, 79, you had 1980, then you had the whole Tehran takeover of the embassy, kidnapping of our embassy officials, Carter was in really serious trouble in terms of politics. He's losing his base, which is conservative Protestant voters. At least he perceives that's his base. And by 79, they're completely disaffected. At that point, out of nowhere, really in a sense, out of nowhere, Jerry Falwell starts the moral majority. In 65, Falwell had said he would never get involved in political action at all. By 79, he starts the moral majority as a reaction. During this period, as you know, the man coming into prominence is Ronald Reagan, politically. Now, Reagan, from a political standpoint, we all know what he was. We knew then what he was. Rhetorically, he was very conservative, fine speaker, probably the greatest political speaker we ever had in this country. And in any case, we have all the recordings and the tapes, and copies of the speeches, and they're powerful speeches. He was an unbelievably gifted man with respect to political rhetoric. Just remarkable, funny. I mean, he was just, there's nothing, we've never seen anything like him. We're never going to see anything like him again. Maybe in a terrible crisis, Churchill was comparable, but nothing else in the 20th century matched him as far as what we would respond to. Some Germans responded to Hitler, but I could never figure out why if you listen to his rhetoric. I mean, the guy was always screaming. I can't figure it out. Reagan I can figure out, master of rhetoric. He's gaining force the whole time. He attempts to get the nomination in 76, does not quite make it. Ford loses. That opens it up to Reagan to build his base. And he's building the base, and his base is clearly conservative Protestant people who are moving into politics to a great extent because of Roe v. Wade. And they got sidetracked with Carter briefly, but the miracle of Jimmy Carter turned out to be something less than a miracle. And so you began to have a political reaction among the conservatives who for the first time were beginning to come out politically and now felt betrayed, but here's a man who at least sounds like they sound. And he attends a church in California that is known as an evangelical church, even though it's in the more liberal Presbyterian denomination. Don Mumma is perceived correctly as a conservative man, theologically, spiritual man. Throughout his governorship, he's perceived as basically a Protestant conservative. He doesn't say much in public theologically. He doesn't really say anything. But he's perceived as a Christian Protestant fundamentalist, or at least evangelical figure, which in fact he is or was. And you could tell that from Michael Reagan's testimony at the funeral of how strong the father's testimony was. It didn't rub off on the non-adopted kids, but it was clear from Michael that it took. He understood the message. It was as strong a Christian testimony as I've ever seen publicly in the United States for that large an audience. So kind of speaking for his father, I think. So we don't really know, but what we know is there are problems. And there is a meeting, there are two meetings that take place in 1980, and these two meetings are the turning point. One meeting was called Washington for Jesus, and that was in the spring. And thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of Christians show up at this kind of giant, not a political rally, but a prayer rally for the country in Washington. And a number of figures who later became prominent or at least active in what is called the Christian right or New Christian right came to that meeting, as well as Bill Bright and other figures who were part of the evangelical Protestant community. Now that was not an earth-shaking event. But it indicated that a lot of people showed up to Washington, what appeared to be something like a political rally. And then, that September, there was a meeting that was a political rally. It gets almost no attention on the web, almost none, except from things I've written about it. But it was the turning point. It was called the National Affairs Briefing Conference. And at that conference, organized by a man named Ed McAteer, from the Christian Round Table, and put together by a number of men who had skills in political mobilization. Two groups, really three groups showed up, two, depending on how you define them. The first group were political trainers, activists, Beltway activists. People like Paul Weyrich, who's a very skilled man in getting out the vote. Howard Phillips, another figure who's been around for a long time, very skilled in terms of understanding political action, political alignments. This is part of what was the leftover of the old Goldwater movement as extended by a man named Richard Viguerie, who had a very powerful mailing list, multi-million-dollar empire based on a relatively small mailing list of Goldwater donors in 1964. He got the list and began building this giant political operation, which is called the New Right. And these political technicians show up to speak, and they invite, because of McAteer, who knows everybody, and everybody trusts in the movement, McAteer gets into one giant arena in Dallas. He gets several of the men who had been elected as the head of the Southern Baptist Convention, like Adrian Rogers and Bailey Smith. Phyllis Schlafly is there, political activist, been involved in, at that point, had been actively involved in the Goldwater movement, made herself famous with her book, A Choice Not an Echo. She's with the Eagle Forum. People who like the LaHays, who've come in, they're upset about Roe v. Wade. And pastors, hundreds and hundreds of them. And the lure is they've invited the three candidates for president. There were three that year. People forget. There was Ronald Reagan, and there was Jimmy Carter, there was John Anderson. And they're all invited to come out at the end of this three-day training session. They're invited to come out and give an oration of some kind on the final night. And Carter doesn't show, and Anderson doesn't show, and Reagan shows. He is preceded by one of the most powerful speeches I have ever heard by a man named James Robertson, who's still on television, but he's not a particularly powerful speaker anymore. He went through some kind of a religious crisis or something about 18 months later, and his whole demeanor changed. It was one of the most powerful speeches I've ever heard. And he warned him, he said, do not become identified with one political party. Do not wind up, basically he said, do not wind up in the hip pockets of any political party. And he was right. It was a powerful presentation. I mean, it was something. Then he sat down, and Reagan got up, and Reagan gave, again, an extraordinary speech. And in that speech, he had a line which stuck. And he said, having heard Robertson's speech, you can't endorse me, but I can endorse you. And with that phrase, he grabbed 13,000 people, grabbed them. He was a master of rhetoric. He was elected within 2 months, overwhelmingly elected, out of nowhere. They really didn't know what hit them. There were compromises that were made. The obvious one was the compromise of Bush being on the vice president's ticket. There were compromises in terms of the staffing of his immediate advisors. It was another CFR group for the most part, but he really was his own man. And on the issues he regarded as really important, like stopping the Soviet Union from expanding and getting the tax cuts on the high marginal rates, on the issues that he said, I'm going to win, he won. He did win. So on the other issues, I guess we don't care. I mean, I do care, but in a sense, you would have to say that he got what he wanted in his own way, despite the fact that nobody seemed to advise him. He seemed to know what to do. This began the real emergence of what is now called the Christian right. As a result, millions, and probably tens of millions, but certainly millions of voters who had been essentially non-activist, who had been out of the loop politically, came back in the loop politically. And there were so many of them who now appeared to be voting as a bloc that it was the largest single voting bloc which had come into play since the end of World War II. And this scared the establishment for good reason. Because that many votes, which they can't control, coming out not from left field but from right field, using language they knew nothing about, which is theological language, they don't know how to handle it. And so at this point you have now what I would call the beginning of the move out of the shadows, where you begin to see activism come back. Now you have a whole series of fights that take place. Obviously Roe v. Wade continues to be an issue. The whole ERA movement, the Equal Rights Amendment, Phyllis Schlafly picks that up and runs with it and beats the whole establishment with that issue. Almost, I wouldn't say single-handedly, because she's got this army of women behind her, but she did it as a representative figure, basically by herself, saying we're going to stop this thing, and she stopped it. I really don't think they ever recovered from it. I mean, I really think it was like seeing an animal hit in the head by a shotgun shell. They staggering around. They never really got over the fact that Phyllis beat them. She really did. Tough lady. She is a tough lady, and she never looks any older. I mean, I get grayer and my hair is turning white, and Phyllis has exactly the same hairdo in exactly the same way, in exactly the same weight as she did 40 years ago. It's you think maybe she's got this picture of herself in her bedroom, and it's getting older and older. It's hard to believe how she does this. Fearless, absolutely fearless woman, and doing it in the name of Christ. Now she's Catholic, and because of that, other Protestants who really have not been favorable to Catholics, other Protestants are looking and saying, she can stop the ERA. And so Beverly LaHaye comes in with now 400,000 people on the mailing list, and James Dobson comes in saying, we got to join with Phyllis and stop this thing, and they do. Because they had to stop it. They believed it. And they're fighting on the abortion issue the same way. This begins to change the whole face of American politics, because you've got Catholics and Protestants now cooperating on issues that they see as jointly shared. This has never happened before. Issues are getting clearer that were not clear before. And Roe v. Wade forces it. That one really gets, we would think, crystal clear. Now, we still have millions of Christians where it's not crystal clear. And a whole pastorate who don't seem to think that it's crystal clear. It was clear to political activists at that point. These issues begin to bring figures into prominence. Pat Robertson, because he has the technology of the satellites, becomes a major, major player and is basically a conservative guy. And is not politically stupid, because Pat Robertson's father was Willis Robertson, who for years was the head of the Senate Banking Committee. So this, Pat Robertson did not fall off the political turnip truck as a kid. He is a politically astute man. Falwell, of course, with the moral majority, becomes a prominent figure speaking out on political issues. So you begin to have this replacement of the old pietistic, quiet, non-political, non-controversial leadership within the conservative movement, the conservative theological Protestant movement. One figure, of course, never changes. One person never changes, and that's Billy Graham. And Graham, from 1949, when he appears out of nowhere in Southern California for the crusade, about September in Los Angeles. Graham appears out of nowhere, begins this tent rally, and the oddest thing almost anybody has ever heard takes place. and that is the aging William Randolph Hearst, who gave us the Spanish-American War, and Citizen Kane indirectly. William Randolph Hearst sends out a 2-word telegram to all of the editors of all of the Hearst newspapers. 2 words, "Puff Graham." And they puffed him. And the stories began to roll out on this amazing crusade that's taking place in Southern California. Now, why Hearst did it? One of the oddest things I've ever encountered in history. I mean, the guy was a reprobate. He's a world-famous adulterer. Why does he do this? But he does. And Graham's career takes off. He becomes widely heralded as a powerful speaker. He begins crusades around the country. He meets with Harry Truman. He's hobnobbing with the president. He meets later with Dwight Eisenhower. He seems to be very conservative. He's an anti-communist. He's very vocal in his anti-communism. But he has a problem, and the problem is 1957. He wants to have a New York crusade. And he can't get Madison Square Garden because basically it's closed to him, and it's closed to him because the now newly named National Council of Churches says, well, we have to have cooperation with all of the denominations and all of the local churches and not just the conservative fundamentalist ones. That's the only way he can get in the door. So he agrees to it. John D. Rockefeller writes a $75,000 check. The National Council becomes co-sponsor, or at least participating. And Graham, from that point on, you begin to see the reduction of his rhetoric against communism. He becomes the friend of every president. Every president has to have a photo op with Billy Graham. It's not the other way around, as they need the photo opportunity with Graham. And this, of course, he gets in real trouble, of course, afterwards with Nixon, because he's very, very close to Nixon. And then it blows up after Watergate when the tapes are released about what Nixon says and the language Nixon uses and so forth. So, but he comes out untarnished. He is a representative through this period right up until the present day of non-political, non-confrontational Christianity. He is the old pietism. And he's widely respected, and he's brought a lot of people to Christ, and he's had lots and lots of crusades, and he's been on national television. But the fact of the matter is, he is a representative of the 50s, the 40s, the 50s. And he does not basically respond to the challenges of the 70s and the 80s. And he was recently quoted, a very old man. They said, well, what do you think of the homosexual issue, the gay marriage issue? He said, well, I don't like to get into that. I think the most important issue of our day is overcoming poverty. That was about 3 weeks ago, maybe a month. Overcoming poverty. This is not what they signed up for back in 1949. So you have this division that still exists inside the Protestant community. Meanwhile, as you well know, the Catholic Church, after 1965, goes rapidly, almost within hours it seems, in the direction of theological liberalism. The seminaries are taken over. The fight now is on in the seminaries, or in the Catholic seminaries, over the homosexual issue. You know, are they going to kick out all the students who are openly homosexual? And their problem is that may be up to 50% of all the seminarians, and the Pope knows that. Major crisis. Massive crisis. Really historically unprecedented crisis. And this is taking place in what in the 50s was a very, very conservative church under Pius XII. Fulton J. Sheen was one of the most popular television personalities of the early 1950s, and he was, open Catholic, and he stood with a piece of chalk in front of a blackboard and gave speeches about the evils of communism and the evils of sin and all the problems going on. And he was one of the most highly rated figures on television in 1953, 54, that period. Amazing audience that he had. Highly conservative man. All of this begins to disappear within Catholicism after 1965. So now you have the conservative Catholics are looking around them. Everything is disintegrating. They don't have fish on Fridays anymore. They don't have the Latin Mass anymore. They got guitars coming out of their ears in their liturgical services. They're looking around and says, this looks like a bunch of liberal Methodists. And that's because theologically it was like a bunch of liberal Methodists. And this happens, I'm telling you, this happens within a period of just a couple of years. Overwhelming. Here's a church that has been rock hard, hardly budged since the Protestant Reformation. And between 1965 and 1970, 71, that period is completely transformed. So the conservative Catholics, looking around them, swamped on all sides by what appear to be liberal Protestants, which theologically is pretty much what it is, they begin to join forces with the conservative Protestants against the general push, the general direction of cultural disintegration in the country. And the Protestants, looking around them, and they've of course been looking around them since 1926 and saying, we're surrounded by theological liberals who don't believe anything that we believe, are happy to get any kind of political backup that they can get to go out to overturn Roe v. Wade. And so this overcomes this whole American tradition that's been going on since about 1850 of the war between the Catholics and the Protestants. Now it's the war between the Catholics and the Catholics and the Protestants and the Protestants. And alliances are now made both among the liberal Catholics and Protestants and among the conservative Protestants and Catholics to fight the drift that has come, the erosion that has come within their own circles. This is unheard of in 1960. Nobody could have predicted this in 1960. People were, gee, he's a Catholic. Should we vote for Kennedy? He's a Catholic. He was a humanist is what he was. The Kennedys are not known for their strong commitment to traditional Catholicism. And once they figured out Kennedy is, he becomes this martyr, from that point on, everybody's put up with Kennedy was okay, we could live with Kennedy and so forth. He becomes this martyr in retrospect. So nobody's afraid of the old fear of, well, there's going to be a president following the orders of the Pope. The person who was most scared in 1970 of a president who was going to follow the Pope is a conservative Catholic, because they're dealing with Paul VI, who is selling out 1,000 years of tradition to the liberals. Tremendous change taking place. Now, what's the defining issue theologically? Well, it's life and death. It's who is man? Is man made in the image of God? Do we kill babies? That's the defining issue after 73. The representative of the people who are battling, they're coming out of nowhere. They're coming out of, we know it's Francis Schaeffer and Coop and Schlafly and Falwell and Beverly LaHaye. These are the representatives of the conservative position. Well, what's common about them? They're becoming politically active. So the conservatives are coming back out of the shadows now. And they now have the key representative to represent them, who is Reagan. And they're committed to Reagan. And he, at least verbally, is anti-abortion. He doesn't do much to push it, but at least verbally, rhetorically, he's a pro-life figure. Now, who are the pro-abortion figures of comparable reputation? Who's standing out there saying, got to have pro-choice, got to have a woman's right to choose? There's no major figure that I can see. They're the National Organization of Women and the feminist organizations, and they're the non-entities of the Democratic Party who may be interviewed about it, but is there anybody comparable to Ronald Reagan or Phyllis Schlafly, who is known as the lightning rod and the spear carrier for the pro-abortion movement? Everybody seems to want to stand in the back. They're going to vote pro-abortion, but nobody seems to want to be the spear carrier on that particular issue. And so you begin to see this shift. And by the way, just as a side remark, almost exactly the same thing is taking place in Great Britain with Margaret Thatcher, who is an extraordinarily gifted speaker, whose vocabulary literally does not have the word she never missed a beat as she gave a speech or an interview or anything else. This woman was almost as gifted rhetorically as Reagan. They both show up at the same time, which is kind of amazing. And there's no comparable liberal figure anywhere. I mean, anywhere. The Russian leadership at this stage is a bunch of guys who mostly are plugged into catheters. They are barely functioning. They're dying one right after the other until Gorbachev. Now, of course, it changes with Gorbachev. And then you get three of them, three figures. But Gorbachev does not survive the transition in '91. Now, you've got the conservative Protestants with their back against the wall, and now they're coming back, in a sense, politically mobilized. Catholics tend to be, they have been politically mobilized, but they've been tied to the Democratic Party for all these years, and now they begin to switch. The conservatives begin to switch to the Republicans. You know the phrase, the hard hat Republicans, the blue collar Republicans. What they're really saying is Catholics in the Northeast and the Rust Belt states. That's who they're talking about when they talk about hard hat Republicans. This switch takes place with Reagan. Now, what are the legal and moral issues? Obviously, abortion is the issue. Education becomes an issue. We are back to 1926, 25, 22. The difference this time, though, unlike the fight in 1925, is not how do we reform the public schools. The issue is how do we get out of the public schools? And you begin to see the exodus. It really begins in the 60s, but it becomes much more visible in the 70s. And as a result, as the Christian school movement begins to attract the sons and daughters of these conservative Protestant voters, the parents begin to lose their willingness to come out strongly in favor of the public schools. They make a major break. Now, it's a small minority, but they're representative. It's a change that takes place that the liberals have no idea how they're going to deal with this. And the issue is parental rights. They don't want the kids in the schools where the pro-abortion forces are handing out condoms or are secretly taking their daughters off without their permission to get abortions. The Equal Rights Amendment, again, becomes another major issue, a legal issue, we believe, and did believe, and Phyllis believed, a moral issue. And then the rise of the homosexual rights, and in our day, the gay marriage movement. And that, again, is another area of confrontation which is political because it's manifested and fought out in the political battlefields. The difficulty that we have, though, in this period is the quest for a consistent worldview that is non-Darwinian. That's crucial. Everybody figures that one out. We cannot fight this thing based on accepting any of the premises of evolution. So they know that. They don't really trust the state, and they certainly don't trust the state's judgment on education. So they've broken with a major institution of the modern political order. They do see the cultural rot around them. Buchanan and others have this phrase, the culture wars, and it is a culture war. That's what it is. It's a culture war. But then, how do you fight something with nothing? What's the cultural alternative to the rot that we find around us? What is the cultural alternative to movies that are R-rated and at war with Christianity? And there we don't have trained people, we don't have capital, we don't have most of the things that we need to crack Hollywood. We don't seem to have any way to crack the networks. We don't seem to be prepared to offer anything as an alternative. You can't beat something with nothing. You can't fight a consistent, evolutionary, Darwinian worldview with tender feelings and an occasional letter to the editor about the latest R-rated movie. The kids aren't going to buy that. if the kids are addicted to rock and roll, you either got to get them off of it, which is almost impossible given cheap Japanese FM radios and Walkmans. So how are you going to break the addiction? And for some people it is an addiction to the worst of the rock music. Well, you got to have better music. Well, what we tend to do is to have Christian rock bands and then Christian hard metal rock bands, which is the old lipstick on a pig problem. We need a generation of students who've been trained on classical music, who understand music theory, who are skilled performers at whatever instrument they have taken up, who can get together and to begin to reverse the decadence around them. In other words, you got to beat something with something better. And if you're not willing to commit to beating something with something better, you're going to get rolled over in the battlefield. You're going to lose the war. And that's been the problem that the Christians have been facing. They are now saying, well, we know that neutrality is a myth. Okay, that's a big step in the right direction. Neutrality is a myth. Okay, what's the alternative? And you wait. Well, what's the alternative? If the other side is not neutral and it's headed for destruction, then what's the alternative? In politics, in economics, in art, in education, in everything we call culture, in FM radio, if what we're facing is not neutral, if what we're facing is systematically and self-consciously anti-Christian, then what do you put in its place? What do you offer in its place? And the answer is, so far, I'm not sure. I watch CBN once in a while, not much. They used to have soap operas that were Christian soap operas with girls who didn't seem to be very good actresses. I didn't follow those soap operas. I've unplugged the television, but I did that a long time ago. I don't watch much on television, but that's hard to get people to do. It's a withdrawal without much. You can be an intelligent watcher of movies that aren't too bad, and to have enough sense not to be sucked in, one would hope, to the worldview that the movie is pushing, because with the exception of something like The Passion of Christ, you don't have many movies that are self-consciously Christian out there. And once in a while you get something that comes down the pike like Chariots of Fire, but that was 1980. I'd sure like a follow-up. Tender Mercies was a fine film. The Horton Foote has been writing great plays since about 1938. But there are not a lot of Horton Foote plays and not a lot of Horton Foote movies, at least not the ones that make it into the major theaters. We really have a problem of the production of quality products, quality artistic, cultural products, to say, we've got something better. Now, I think it's pretty easy in the public schools to say we have a better program in the public schools. If you teach a kid to read and write and stay off drugs, you've probably got a better product than the public schools. So that's not so difficult. But in terms of the curriculum materials, what curriculum is out there that is training up cultural warriors? If we're told we're in a culture war, then what do you fight with? With what tools do you fight? With what strategic plan do you fight? And it is a culture war. And you don't want to lose the culture war. All right, if you're called to a battlefield, who's got the battle plan? Who's got the tactics? Who's got the strategy? What are the principles of warfare that we're to use? And this is where we have failed. This is why we are out of the shadows, but we are not really into the sunlight yet. We are not systematically and self-consciously training the next generation to fight the good fight and to replace that which is evil with that which is good. Now, I would call this the concept of comprehensive redemption. And it's a simple principle. This is really simple stuff. Here's the principle. In every area of life in which Satan has the upper hand, do we grant him immunity or do we recapture and reclaim the territory? Now, if your position is Satan has some kind of claim, legal, legitimate claim on any area of life, then you've said that belongs to the devil and there's no way of overcoming evil. And then you go to the Gospels and you don't get that story. In the Gospels, you're called to confront evil across the board, that goodness is more powerful than evil, that righteousness overcomes rebellion. God does not give King's X for a single square inch of territory to Satan and his host, and he doesn't give a single square inch away in the New Testament period. The Holy Spirit is a universal phenomenon. The church is a universal phenomenon. It's not like Israel in 50 BC where there's one small territory that God has marked out as His own. This is the New Testament. The Gentiles have brought in, the Spirit has come down, the gospel has gone out, the Bible is completed. This is an era for conquering territory. Europe is lost, I think. The birth rate is such that they'll disappear within 300 years, and the Muslims will recapture them, probably within 300 years, maybe in a century. Europe is lost. There's no trace of the birth rate of Christianity left sufficient to turn it back, I think. And Islamic birth rates are high enough. Now they're falling, but they're still high enough. They're still so much higher than the traditional European population. In Western Europe is lost. Okay, now what about us? Now we're reclaiming, Christianity is being reclaimed in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. An enormous revival is going on. What's going on in China is of such immense magnitude that we can't even measure it. There were, in 1973, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, there were believed to be no Protestants left in China. Now, of course, they were underground, but the government didn't know where they were. 1973, Roe v. Wade, right? The minimum estimate that the government makes today is 25 million. The minimum estimate that I've heard from the missionary organizations is 50 million. And one of the men in my home church who is a national Chinese and is involved in Chinese translation say, we here, meaning we as in Chinese, working with indigenous Chinese and getting out gospel materials and Bibles, he says, we think it's probably closer to 80 million people. Now, of course, in China, it's about 5% of the population. But compared to us, and compared to what it was in 1973, this is the biggest revival in history. And Latin America, the same kind of thing is taking place. Enormous transformation of Latin America. Now, it's not particularly Western. It's an indigenous movement, and it's mixed in with all kinds of strange practices that we would not be familiar with. But it is a transformation that's taking place below us, and in southern Africa, and certainly in China, and the number of missionaries being sent out by South Korea is second only to the United States. And that's your test of if Christianity has taken root, missionaries, foreign missionaries, are the proof that it's taken root. It didn't take, sadly, it did not take in Japan. Wish it had, it didn't. Maybe it will. But it's taken place throughout Asia. So here we sit in what is like not a stalemate. There's warfare going on. There's a reversal of what it was in 1970, surely. That the kinds of representatives who exist today, if you're to look at Shafley and LaHaye and Robertson for all of his faults and the business about assassinating Chavez, which seems to be preposterous, but for all of the fumbling and the mumbling of the Christian Protestant leadership, and for all of the lack of any kind of a strategic vision, and for all of the lack of a consistent worldview, it is not 1970. And the technology is on our side. Everything's going decentralized. Every month, the ratings of the network news drop. Every month, the ratings of the network system drop. They're being spread out to all the cable systems and the satellite systems. And now to video games. More money is now generated in America by the video games than is generated by the Hollywood movie industry. Everything is moving in a decentralized direction. As bandwidth becomes more available, as technology of cameras and all of the technology that go into making movies begins to drop in price, as it has dropped in price, the barrier to entry that has kept Christians out of the entertainment industry, those barriers are falling incredibly fast. 20 more years and the barriers are only going to be the skill of how to make a movie. It's the skill barrier, not the technological barrier, that will keep Christians out. Technology's on our side in this battle. So the question then is, what do we place as the alternative? How do we fight the culture wars if we do not have a battle plan and if we do not even have a training manual that we agree on? Some form of a training manual. It's going to change. It's going to change worldwide, unquestionably. I see a tremendous positive movement worldwide, but we're not there. That's not us. We're us. We're here. We're fighting this war, this country, right now. What's our responsibility? Each person has got to find that area of life in which he has a gift, and then he's got to work as hard as he can, raising as much money as he can, to develop that skill, that gift, to put in service of the gospel. And when I say it's full-time Christian service, I mean full-time in terms of whatever it is that you've been called to do. It's full-time. That's an old Protestant doctrine anyway. Luther preached it 500 years ago. The priesthood of all believers. I think it ought to be called the kingship of all believers. You've got to find that area of your life, that area where you have an edge, a skill, a vision. To make things better, you've got to concentrate on that. And if you've got to bootstrap it yourself, then you bootstrap it. If you've got to fund it out of your own income, then you fund it out of your own income. What else can you do? There are no pennies from heaven. There's no tooth fairy that you're going to trade something and you're going to have the money under the pillow. You have to bootstrap it. But so what? Early church bootstrapped it. And that's how the early church began. Martin Luther bootstrapped it. We have the tools, we have the technology. Most of us have the spare time. Pull the plug on the TV. Except for DVDs. DVDs are okay. But if we move to DVDs instead of the standard TV fare, we transform ourselves. That is the vision that American Vision has been committed to for 25 years. Little bitty groups like this, little small organizations like a Christian school starting with practically nothing. We have one in Northwest Arkansas. That man started with nothing about 8 years ago. He's got, I think they've got something like, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of square feet, 250, 275 kids now. They're making their budget. They're offering a first-rate education. It's all by word of mouth. And they've built the building. I mean, it looks like a Japanese pillbox. It is the ugliest building you have ever seen, but inside that building, young kids are getting really first-rate educations. And so are the old kids. That school has won the robotics contest, building the robots that fight each other. It's a national contest. It's won the regional every year, I think, for 3 or 4 years in a row now. And they only have, I think, 10 or 12 kids in the senior class, maybe 20. Nobody can beat them. Public schools, anybody, they can't beat them. Because they're dedicated, they're really hard workers, and they have a very good teacher who's an ex-engineer, and he helps them. And these are just little stories that we don't have to do it beautiful. But this school really is ugly. I mean, it really is ugly. But who do you care? They built it themselves. They got very little debt on it. They're meeting their payments. The kids are getting a good education. It's filled. So what do we care if it looks ugly? I don't care. The question is, what's the quality coming out? This is not a matter of bricks and mortar. This is a matter of vision and commitment. That's what it's a matter of, not bricks and mortar. We don't need the bricks and mortar. Bricks and mortar are helpful for certain kinds of organizations. Certain times you do need bricks and mortar, but if you don't offer a good service, you're not going to get any bricks and mortar anyway. If you offer a good service, you can get the bricks and mortar. The problem is not money. The problem is competence. Money comes if you're good. If you offer a good service, the money will come. And if you offer a bad service, you better hope the money doesn't come because you ought to go into something else anyway. The money will only trick you, lure you away. Christ said that real clearly, over and over. Don't look to the money. The mammon is not worth worshiping. Mammon's a tool. Money's a tool. If you can get money for a project, terrific. It's a tool. It's not a God. We now are in the culture wars. We see the culture wars. Now we got to fight the culture wars. And you can't do it by sitting around on the sidelines and wringing your hands and saying, it's terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible, woe is us, nothing can be done. You fight the war by you take the war to the enemy. You go on the offensive. The left's in what shape is the left in? How many guys campaign politically with the big L word, I'm a liberal, vote for me? This isn't 1950. This is not 1960. Who's their leader? Who represents the intellectual left of the country? Who is the articulate visionary with the rhetorical skills of a Reagan who's mobilizing the secular humanist world? Not there. It's not there. They're on the defensive. They got the money. They got votes. They control the school boards. And there's an exodus beginning. So you keep the school board, we'll keep the kids. It's a good deal. I'd let them have the money. Would you, if you knew that by increasing taxes for the school board by 50%, there'd be a 50% exodus of students the next year, would you accept those taxes? I'd put up with it. I wouldn't fight it if I knew there was a cause and effect relationship. And the more money the public schools get, the worse the education gets. The more money they spend per capita for students, because it's not for students, it's for administration, the more money that they spend on administration and bricks and mortars, what happens to the education? It gets worse and worse. The scores go down. The disruption goes up. The crime goes up. The drugs go up. And they spend more money. Give me the kids, you keep the money. That's a good trade for me. And that's what we're doing. We've got to have better schools and better curriculum materials and more curriculum materials. More competition. That's what we need. And I think we're going to get it. It's certainly better than it was in 1960, and I was there in 1960. It's better. This is the background of American Vision. I have a website, GaryNorth.com. You can always come by. I've got a whole section. All of my books, commentaries on the Bible are up. You can download them for free. I think there's 17 volumes out now, something like that. Anyway, a bunch of stuff you can download for free. You can download, you can come to the American Vision site on a regular basis. Come to the site, see what is available. It's being given for free. Train yourself, discipline yourself, get these materials, use these materials, put them into action. This is the way that you transform a civilization, not by sitting on the sidelines and saying, oh, woe is us, woe are us, we can't win this thing. You take it to the enemy because they're on the defensive. They look strong, they look powerful, they got a lot of money. They're on the defensive. This is not 1925 anymore.